Hello, welcome to this interview with Dr. Nan Zhang, who is an Associate Professor of English at Fudan University and an Honorary Associate Professor of English at the University of Hong Kong. She received her PhD in English literature from Johns Hopkins University. She works on 19th and early 20th century British literature and global modernism. Her research interests also include cosmopolitan studies, history of political thought, aesthetics and ethics, and economics. Dr. Nan Zhang, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Bingshu, for having me here. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to discuss my work with you and your colleagues here.
Thank you. My name is Bingshu Zhao. I'm a PhD student in political theory at Exeter and also a research assistant for the Center for Political Thought. Today, I'm here also with Dario and Sarah, who are also part of this interview. So first of all, Dr. Nan, we want to start from your intellectual background and academic formation. So how did you get interested in literary studies and more specifically in English literature and the Victoria era?
I actually had taken a detour before I could focus on literary studies. I have always been passionate about literature, thanks to a generally open-minded attitude towards the outside world and the proliferation of good quality translations of foreign literature in China. In my formative years, I felt very much at home in the worlds of Tolstoy, Shakespeare, Rousseau, and so forth. For various reasons, I majored in international finance in college, and for a long time, felt quite marooned in a strange world of facts and figures. In hindsight, however, I think my training in economics and finance has both intensified my wish to concentrate on literature and has enabled me to adopt interdisciplinary approaches to literary studies. When formulated as a branch of knowledge that deals with how to satisfy unlimited wants and needs with limited resources, economics has great attractions for me. For the attention of the human motives and inclinations seems to me to align with literature's investment in unfolding the complexities of human psyche and mentality, as well as the richness of the inner world. So I found it natural, for instance, that Adam Smith inquired into issues of wealth and moral sentiments. At the same time, similarly, John Maynard Keynes' concern with full employment in his macroeconomic theory seems very consistent with his emphasis on literature and art in his vision of good life. So Keynes did draw my attention to the Bloomsbury group after I switched to literary studies in graduate school. And my fascination with the work by Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster, and T.S. Eliot quickly extended my interest to modernist literature in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and to the field of modernist studies at large. So while modernism as a literary and artistic movement has often been considered to signify a break from the past or the immediate past of the Victorian era, I find it essential and nourishing to tap into Victorian literature and culture in order to achieve more profound understanding of modernism and literature at large.
Well, thank you for telling us such a fascinating journey of your academic life. And so the next question is about your recent research. In your article on Adam Burke, Virginia Woolf, and the Negotiation of Virtue, as well as your recently published book on Woolf and the Bloomsbury Group, you shed light on the modernist writers' engagement with various forms of civic virtue in a global context. So could you elaborate a bit more about Woolf's insights into virtue and public spirits, also in the context of her engagement with the kind of more global and transcultural context of her own time, including her experience, or the general experience of imperialism and colonialism? And more generally, do you think there is a kind of somewhat distinctive Chinese perspective on the Western literature in your research?
Thank you very much for the question. It contains two parts. So I will first address Wolf's engagement with the issues you just mentioned, and then say a little bit about my own perspective in relation to Chinese culture and tradition. So the violence and the rapacity of imperialism and colonialism, has been all too familiar to us today. Meanwhile, we also know that an ideology of so-called civilizing nation underlies the new imperialism at the turn of the 20th century. This is an idea that civilized, in quotation marks, civilized nations should promote civilization among, in quotation marks, primitive peoples, and uplift them economically, morally, and politically. And this idea drew heavily on notions of civic virtue and public spirit in mobilizing support from the metropole. These notions were already prevalent in the public school ethos in late Victorian England. Stephen Kleene, for one, has provided very insightful analysis of the subject. So Virginia Woolf's depiction of virtue and public spirit in my reading is situated within such a historical context. I think Woolf's engagement embodies endeavors that challenged imperialist policies and practices by confronting their moral apologetics with demands for civilized virtues, civilized values and sympathies delinked from racial and national biases. In other words, Woolf didn't just criticize the intertwined forces of patriarchy and imperialism, as many scholars have pointed out. She opposed an official discourse of virtue with a countervailing spirit of solidarity across national boundaries. If there is a, now I want to say a little bit more about my own perspective. If as you have pointed out, there is a distinctly Chinese perspective in my research. It's not always conscious, I think, definitely not in the beginning. I had always wanted to achieve some distance from my own mindset, shaped by my environment, if that kind of distance is possible at all. I had thought that intellectual immersion in a different literature and tradition would help toward that goal. But then I became increasingly aware of how one's perspective is inevitably inflected by the cultural tradition in which one was brought up. So my interest in civic humanist discourses and the questions concerning virtue and the public spirit, it has later dawned on me, has to do with influences of Confucian culture and tradition, which of course doesn't mean officialized accounts of Confucianism. Now I find it productive to adopt rather than disavow comparative perspectives and approaches. And the globalized turn in almost every field of research in academia these days has certainly allowed for more substantive and valuable comparisons and critical self-reflections.
Thank you for this answer.
Thank you. And Dr. Nan, speaking of various perspectives globally, now we're going to talk about someone who was writing in India. In your discussion of Rabindranath Tagore's novel, The Home and the World, you show the main protagonist, Nikhil's, being at the crossroads of a rootedness in a Buddhist spiritual tradition that I thought we could take as a metaphor for the home. But at the same time, Nikhil, you point out, has an impulse towards a universal shared humanity that we could perhaps understand as a metaphor for the world. So could you maybe shed some light on how modernist thought reconciles these two ideals, or more simply, the home and the world?
Right. The spatial tropes of the home and the world operate on various levels in Tagore's novel and in modernist literature at large. In one sense, the home draws our attention to ideas of nation and nationhood as an opposition to the oppressive power of imperialism and colonialism. That is an important part of the political context of many modernist novels in the early 20th century. While Tagore's novel highlights the conflicts between colonial power and the nationalist advocacies, it also addresses the moral and affective ramifications of such conflicts. That's why many moral philosophers, such as Martha Nussbaum, have drawn upon this novel to articulate their arguments concerning the relationship between patriotism and the cosmopolitanism. Within cosmopolitan studies, there is recognition that the universal sympathies need to be reconciled with at least some forms of local attachments. Otherwise, cosmopolitanism will become rootless, if not a hollow or colorless ideal. Tagore's privileged protagonist, Nikhil, is in many ways a cosmopolitan thinker or a kind of Kantian philosopher, as Nussbaum has cogently argued. But his affinity for Buddhist worldview enriches understanding of cosmopolitan thinking, which can draw energy and inspiration from diverse sources and traditions. So that's part of the argumentative purposes of this article. So modernism is well known for its complicated relationship with tradition in an accelerated world of globalization. If the idea of home in the early 20th century involved wrestling with one's own culture and tradition, the keen awareness of a shared world impelled one to move beyond their constraints, perceptually, conceptually, and attitudinally. I don't think modernist literature often reconciles the tension between the home and the world successfully. If you recall, the tragic ending of Tagore's novel reminds us of the difficulty of reconciliation. But we do see strenuous efforts directed towards bringing the home and the world together in modernist literature. And those efforts, in my reading, remain part of the attraction of modernism.
Thank you. And speaking of reconciling opposites, your reading of Tagore's novel brings into relief another dualism in parallel with that of the home and the world that we were just talking about. And the second one is more concerned with two different ways of trying to shake off colonial subjection. So the first would be through a violent nationalism, and the other towards a spiritual opening towards the universal, as you have been talking about. The first, I thought, could partly appropriate the language of the colonizer in confronting violence with violence, whereas the other seems perhaps to neglect the colonial subjection, in fact, supposes a separation from the human, which is the colonizer, in quotations, who assumes moral authority, from the subhuman, who the colonizer regards as his subaltern and his morally inferior. So could these two impulses be reconciled or combined in a way that the spiritual non-violent opening makes room for the agency of resistance that could then place the colonized on an equal footing with her colonizer?
Right. I do appreciate the two approaches you just very aptly summed up. So I think as forms of resistance against the colonial subjugation, the two approaches are certainly related. But at the same time, there are also significant differences between them. Tagore's novel depicts two vivid characters that occupy the two positions you have laid out. In contrast to Nikhil, who argues against the belligerent nationalism and also the use of violence. Sandeep Nikhil's counter-number in the novel embraces the logic of confronting violence with violence. But Tagore presents us with a complex account of the corrupting force of violence. Sandeep believes that the lofty end of saving his country justifies the use of violence, but this also inclines him towards a Machiavellian attitude towards others and life at large that turns out to be very dangerous and destructive in the narrative. On the other hand, Nikhil's valuation of moral reasoning and universal sympathy seems rather feeble in the face of brutal violence practiced by both cruel colonizers and impassioned nationalists. Although Tagore's novel emphatically endorses the moral principle and spiritual belief espoused by its privileged character, Nikhil, the novel also portrays a realistic picture of the limitations of moral and spiritual engagement when violence runs wild. Indeed, many liberal-minded modernist writers were faced with a similar predicament in the late 1930s, when the violence of totalitarian regimes provoked militant reactions and left less and less room for gradual spiritual opening. But I think at least Tagore's novel encourages us to think beyond the limited horizons of colonial power and to nurture the agents of resistance. So I do think that's an important aspect of the novel, which even though it doesn't reconcile or harmonize the two approaches you just mentioned, but it provides something very valuable for the readers to think about in the longer term, particularly.
Thank you. That's very insightful.
Thank you very much, Nan. Carry on a bit on a discussion about particularly these two essays which we have been focusing on, but more generally other things you've been working on. There seems to be yet another kind of dualism or distinction, the one between spirituality and materialism. And what it seems in reading what you write, of course, this dualism is both present in the kind of Western civilization. After all, your focus on the Bloomsbury group and the authors you mentioned, of course, wants to draw both aspects. And of course, what you were saying just now in the Tagore's novel. But in a sense, there has always been a kind of, from the Western point of view, justification, some justification also, particularly in 19th and early 20th century of colonialism, this kind of drive towards civilization, bringing civilization, therefore the spiritual, the ideals. But it seems quite clear that the way in which perhaps was received is precisely the opposite. The force of Western civilization was more based on the force of materialism, progress, industries, commerce, and so on and so forth, and not spirituality. So is there a perception really that the kind of colonial imperial experience and post-colonial experience of the Western civilization is more characterized by this emphasis on materialism than the spiritual, which in some way some of the Eastern civilization perhaps sometimes defend, or at least, very even from the West, people have tried to find inspiration, these spiritualities.
Yes, actually, the tension between spiritual and the material dimensions of life is essential to my reading of modernist literature, and definitely my reading of Woolf and Tagore. I think both Woolf and Tagore have exposed and criticized the domination of possessive desires and their intimate relationship with the imperial enterprise. In spite of differences in their cultural orientation and artistic projects, I think Wolf recognizes the importance of material bases, like a room of one's own, for higher ends of life that are more spiritual in her eyes. For instance, in an aesthetic manifesto of hers that also reflects her outlook on life, Wolf divides modern writers into two groups: the materialists, who try to create some external reality, and those who are more spiritual and committed to revealing the flickerings of the inner flame. That's a very Wolfian phrase. The spirit of life, to use Wolf's own phrase, is what modern novelists should try to capture, and what modern readers, by extension, are encouraged to explore. Actually, I think Wolf's stance aligns with a tradition of cultural criticism in the Victorian era, featuring eminent figures including Matthew Arnold, John Ruskin, or Walter Pater, among others. Matthew Arnold, for example, famously denounced faith in machinery as a besetting danger for the whole civilization of a modern world, growing increasingly mechanical and external. In my Tagore essay, I also show some affinities between the ideas of English-educated Nikhil and Arnold. Now, I think it is true that Tagore was sensitive to the detrimental power of Western industrial and imperial forces over other civilizations and traditions, Indian and also Chinese. In that essay, I also talked about Tagore's visit to China, and also the reception of that among Chinese intellectuals in Beijing. But I think Tagore was certainly aware of the significant presence of critical reflections that was crucial, within the Western civilization, that was crucial to the development or success, if you like, of Western civilization. So I do think that the presence of the critical and intellectual force within that civilization is something that intellectuals from other civilizations tend to underestimate. That is definitely something I think my essays try to foreground a little bit more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nan, for that very illuminating discussion. And we do look forward to more of your work, and also to have you back soon for more engagement in the context of the Center of Political Thought at the University of Exeter. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation and look forward to more to be continued.